Hello, everyone. This is Joanne Paano at the National Network for Youth. We are so excited and delighted to welcome you to today's webinar, where we will talk about the power of advocacy and how your voice can change policies. We're so excited to welcome our two colleagues and guest presenters today, Ted Peso and Sharda Hamilton. Ted joined the Knight Ministry in 2008 and is currently the Manager of Advocacy and Community Affairs. In this role, he builds relationships with elected officials and policymakers at all levels of government and works to connect the Knight Ministry's clients to advocacy opportunities. He regularly represents the Knight Ministry in meetings with elected officials and at various CAPS and neighborhood association meetings. Ted is a member of the Chicago's Task Force on Homeless Youth and Chicago Coalition for the Homeless Youth Committee. He received his Bachelor of Arts from Drake University and his Juris Doctor from the John Marshall Law School. Welcoming Sharda. Sharda is passionate about working as a youth leader in Chicago and strives to help others hear her story and homeless journey. She's equally passionate about educating other youth and young adults to identify and gain access to resources she never had as a chance to receive that may be available to them. She enjoys advocacy and is committed to ensuring the voices of other youth and young adults are also heard. An overview of today's agenda for our webinar, again starting with introductions, then going into the value of constituent engagement advocacy, why federal and state legislators need to hear from local service providers, youth with lived experiences, and other community stakeholders. We'll then be transitioning to the topic of advocating for your RHY programs and how to build effective relationships that will be led by Ted. And then next, how young leaders can authentically share about their experiences, led by Sharda. We'll then transition into Q&A and save some time for your questions and answers before we wrap up today's webinar. Again, welcome and introductions of our guest presenters today. And a few housekeeping items before we get started. Folks should be on mute throughout the duration of the webinar, so if you have any thoughts, questions, ideas, or any points of clarification that you needed from us, please feel free to use the question box that's there on your screen. If you go ahead and type your questions, we'll be sure to field those questions towards the end of our presentation, or if there are any issues with the technology, please feel free to as well. So just kicking things off and discussing the value of constituent engagement and advocacy. During this portion of our presentation, we'll discuss again why federal, state, and local legislators need to and want to hear from local communities and constituents, including local service providers, agencies, youth and young adults with lived experience, and other community stakeholders. Why do they want to hear from local communities and experts? Is because constituents are the experts. Communities and constituents like yours are powerful because your lived experiences and worldviews can help to shape and inform the ways that policies are created. As you live and vote in your elected officials' district, you have the ability to tell each and every one of your lawmakers, from U.S. House Representatives to the U.S. Senate, about the issues that directly impact the youth and young adults in your community. And let's not forget that 2020 is just around the corner with a lot at stake with the upcoming election and even re-election for certain members of Congress. Now is the time to really uplift the issues that are directly impacting our communities, such as youth and young adults experiencing homelessness. So just one quote from one of our congressional champions on the Hill. When they are faceless, nameless, and anonymous, it's easy to ignore. This comes from our longstanding champion on the Senate, Senator Patrick Leahy of Vermont. He did speak as part of an upcoming documentary, Lost in America, by Rotimi Water, that explores the landscape of youth and young adults experiencing homelessness. And why does it happen? Why is it that they are nameless, faceless, and anonymous? Well, because they make up an invisible population. We know from our colleagues at Chapin Hall at the University of Chicago that nationally there are 4.2 million youth and young adults experiencing homelessness every day in our country. When broken down into age range, that means that there's about 700,000 adolescent youth between the ages of 13 through 17 and 3.5 million young adults between the ages of 18 through 25. We know based on these statistics that youth homelessness occurs across urban, suburban, and rural communities. And in fact, the data has shown us that the prevalence rate of homelessness is actually similar when it comes to both urban and rural communities, with a slight difference. In terms of the disproportionate impact on specific subpopulations, now data and studies also tell us that youth of color, LGBTQ youth, pregnant and parenting youth, as well as those without a high school degree and or GED, are likely to suffer higher instances of homelessness. And lastly, we know that youth homelessness is broad. The definition itself is fluid, with homelessness taking place in various forms, from living on the streets to couch surfing to staying on someone's couch, that of a friend, a family member, or a relative. And so, knowing that these are some of the data points and also anecdotal experiences of youth and young adults who experience homelessness, that it continues to be an invisible population. And so, how do we make sure that the invisible become visible and that we collectively, as members of our communities, are able to shed light? How do we begin to shed light on an invisible population? How do we uplift the many stories and lives that are impacted by homelessness? Well, it starts all with building relationships. Intentionally building strong relationships with members of Congress and their staff, both in DC and in congressional districts across the country, is a critical first step in effectively advocating for policy change. Engaging the heart, mind, and political health of an elected official is key. And when we discuss the heart, mind, and political health, we're talking about appealing to the emotional appeal of a politician, because, after all, politicians are people first. Engaging their mind by getting them to think about the issues that we care about most that impact our communities. And also having them consider their political health. Have them think about what's at stake, especially given that 2020 elections are right around the corner. Lastly, building relationships with key policymakers happens by being seen and heard as not only an expert, but also as a resource on a particular issue area and subset of issue areas. Here at the National Network for Youth, we take pride in knowing that there are congressional champions and offices who do often turn to us when it comes to the specific policy issue areas, and that we in turn are able to rely on the experiences and expertise of our colleagues in communities, such as service providers, such as young people themselves. And so really just honing in on the value of those relationships is something that we often discuss. And so along the sphere of building relationships, where to start? Where do we begin? Here on the screen, you'll find 6 advocacy activities that we have found most helpful in our work and as also in the work of our local colleagues. You'll see on your screen that it involves everything from setting up a meeting in your district and in your local community. It engages folks to participate in town hall meetings. It includes inviting your U.S. Senator and or House Representative to visit your organization's program. It also takes place in hosting a stakeholders roundtable. It also involves writing an op-ed, a letter to the editor of your local paper, or even a blog that you can post on your organization's website, and participating in e-advocacy. And so even just diving deep into some of these activities that everyone can take part in with setting up a meeting in your district and community, my colleague Ted will go ahead and explain that into further detail later on in our presentation. But we do have information available for folks that includes everything from how to even locate who your legislator is and how to find out where their local office is. How to prepare for your in-district meeting, and how to conduct research, which again Ted will speak on further later on in the presentation. And some of these other advocacy activities include participating in a town hall, what to expect, how to find out what your legislators' key priority issue areas are, and really how to make the most out of those town hall meetings. Inviting your U.S. Senator and or House Representative to visit your organization's program. We have information available in a toolkit that we're getting ready to launch that will have templates and sample talking points, including some of the data that we just discussed earlier in the presentation, available for everyone. Inviting members of Congress and other legislators to host a stakeholders roundtable. We will be providing information on how to even plan for a roundtable, such as who to invite to participate in these conversations, which members of your staff and your organization would be vital as part of the planning process, and what are some of the talking points that you might want to uplift. In terms of writing an op-ed or letter to the editor, we will also be having that information readily available for folks in this advocacy toolkit that we will be getting ready to release, as well as a blog. And then finally, participating in e-advocacy, everything from setting up an action alert to the top 20 tips on using social media and how to engage members of Congress and such. We know from data that tells us that congressional staffers actually believe that using social media allows their office to reach people they otherwise would not be able to reach. And almost half of congressional staffers believe that advocacy campaigns directed at Congress are healthy for democracy. So just really uplifting that point that participating in social media and e-advocacy is a helpful way of engaging in advocacy in general. And as I just shared earlier, some of those 6 advocacy activities that were outlined in the previous slide will be available for everyone. And this is your first look and glance at our upcoming in-district advocacy toolkit. You can learn from the National Network for Youth as we share our in-district advocacy toolkit with everyone in advance of October's congressional recess, where both members of the House and the U.S. Senate will be back home in their communities for the month of October. We'll also be outlining different tips, strategies, and how to prepare for and plan for those advocacy activities at home in your communities. And we'll also be providing links to top industry professional materials, all within the click of a button in this toolkit. So for those who have joined us as part of today's webinar, please stay tuned. We will be following up with an email with all of that information ready for you. And I'm happy to turn it over to my colleague, Ted.
Great. Thank you, Joanne. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Great. So thanks, everyone. I'm happy you were all able to join us today. Like Joanne said, I am Ted Peso. I work at the Knight Ministry in Chicago, Illinois. I've been with the organization for 11 years, and I started out writing our government grants and doing advocacy in my free time. And then several years ago, the organization that I work for, decided that advocacy was really important, and we wanted to put more efforts toward an advocacy program at the Knight Ministry. And so as part of our strategic planning process, we included that in the work that we wanted to do. And over the past several years, I've been transitioned out of government grants and the development team into a new department called Strategic Partnerships that focuses on building relationships within the community, with volunteers, with community members, community leaders, including elected officials. So that's kind of the background I come at this from. Like I said, advocacy is part of our strategic plan at the Knight Ministry, and we had some agency-specific reasons why we wanted to do that, but also some things that I wanted to share with you, some other reasons that I think we all have in common about why we want to do this work, right? So first, if you want to go to the slide, relationship building, advocacy really helps us build relationships. The Knight Ministry really believes that advocacy, or that relationships, are at the core of the work that we do with young people. We can't provide services without first building a trusting relationship with the youth and young adults whom we serve. We build that through a series of progressive engagement and interaction with young people. So we'll, greet them at our street outreach sites. We provide a meal to them right on the street. We provide free hygiene products, free health care, a listening ear. But ultimately, it's that relationship that's built which helps us provide a young person with a safe place to stay and the support that they need to leave the streets. So we also build relationships with members of our community, with volunteers, with neighbors next to our programs, folks like that. So I think of advocacy in a really similar way. You may have heard somebody say that all advocacy is cumulative, everything builds up, right? Well, that's true, and I think a series of interactions between the Knight Ministry and our members of Congress or their staff positions my colleagues as individuals that those members can turn to when the member has to take a position on legislation that impacts youth and young adults experiencing homelessness or trafficking. So those quick meetings on the Hill, the visits that they make to us when they're in district, emails that I send out which contain updates on our programs or identify emerging trends, all those things come together to shape the conversations that our members have in Washington, D.C. and in the district about youth and young adults who are experiencing homelessness. And ultimately, they impact the policies that our nation enacts to end youth homelessness. Advocacy also educates the community and the members that we work with. So our members and their staff deal with many issues. Youth and young adult homelessness is one of a myriad of issues that they'll discuss every day. So when we conduct advocacy with them, it positions us as the expert when it comes to youth and young adults experiencing homelessness. You are the person who gets to tell them how a young person's experience with homelessness is different than an adult or a family or a veteran. You're the one that gets to educate them about the Runaway and Homeless Youth Act and how it's different than HUD-funded programs. You're the one who gets to share what we're learning from the 100-day challenges, the Grand Challenge, and Youth Homelessness Demonstration Project, or YHDP. These are the things that they can only hear from you in your position as a provider. And most importantly, you get to share how this impacts your community, which is also their community. Advocacy also will level the playing field. When you go to DC, you'll see that every industry has folks who are walking the hallways of Capitol Hill. So we should too, right? And you're the person that can do that. Advocacy also advances the work of ending youth and young adult homelessness. So again, all advocacy is cumulative. So if Illinois is one of maybe 4 states that are conducting advocacy around this issue with their members, it isn't going to have as much impact or progress. So really we need a nationwide effort. If only 30 of House members indicate that they want to prioritize funding for RHYA in the next appropriations, that's not going to resonate as much as if 75 or 100 members request increased appropriations. So if you want to go to the next slide. So some of the first steps are kind of the hardest, or can be the hardest. When you think of identifying your member and who you're gonna target for this advocacy effort, be strategic. So what we do at the Night Ministry is we think of the issues that are facing our community at that moment, and where those issues lie with the representatives who are in DC. We also think about what committees they're on. So, for example, if they're on an appropriations committee which determines funding, and we know it's that time of year when Congress is deciding funding, we're more likely to invite that member than a member who may be on a committee that doesn't have any impact on funding. So it's kind of a strategic decision at that point in time. Also, think about where your relationships as an organization lie. I'll talk a little bit more about that later, but you might prioritize a member who has a relationship with a member of your board or lives on your block, right? Just think about those relationships and be strategic with the relationships. Sometimes that first call that you make to somebody can be the hardest, right? So what I always do is I just call their district office. I go to their website and I find out where their district is, where the closest office is located in my district, and I just call them up and I speak to the person that answers the phone. And I say, hey, I work for the Night Ministry in Chicago. We provide these services in the district, and we'd like to invite the congressman or the congresswoman or the senator to come visit our program. Usually they'll tell me the right person to talk to, or they'll ask me to send an email to somebody, and then I do that. I always follow up if I send an email with a phone call. If I make a phone call, I always follow up with an email. The one thing I will say is a lot of the websites do have online meeting request forms. I tend not to use those because I don't know where they go, and I haven't found a lot of success with them. So I always find that personal connection, making a phone call first, is what produces the best results. A lot of times, the person you'll get a meeting with is a staff member, so accept it. Remember that the member is their boss, and the information that you provide that staff member with will help them look good in front of their boss. And ultimately, it's about educating your member, and that will get you the same results as if you met with a member. So if you want to go to the next slide. So when we talk about planning your visit, some of the things that I think about when I plan a visit is identifying who my host committee will be. So I really like to have a robust host committee, not too many people, but I usually include a member of our executive team, a board member. I include a direct service staff, and I try to include a young person or a client. So just some tips around that. When I work with young people, and Sharda will talk about this a lot more, I try to let them decide how they want to be involved in the visit, and I want that to feel really authentic. So that's why I do that, and let them decide how they choose to be involved in the visit. A great thing about involving direct staff is I think advocacy really gives some of our frontline staff an opportunity that allows them to feel like they're making a difference in work that can sometimes be challenging to them. So I know when we implemented coordinated entry in Chicago, it was a challenge to have to go through that process, and some of our staff really was frustrated and felt stuck. And so we used advocacy as a way to allow them to express some of those feelings in a way that was helpful and positive, right? So talk about the issues that they were being faced with and suggest some challenges. They were meeting with folks that make decisions in our community. You can do the same thing with elected officials. So it helps your direct line staff feel like, you know, they're making a difference in work that can sometimes feel frustrating to them. So doing your research, Joanne talked a little bit about this. The things that I think about when we talk about doing your research is thinking about why that member might be interested in your issue. If we're trying to build a relationship with that member, we want to think about ways that they might feel some commonality with the work that we're doing. So I always think about, like, are they a parent? Did they lose a parent at an early age? Do they identify as LGBTQ? Are they an educator? Those are all things in the past that we've learned to ask and that we found some value in. So we try to find that commonality with them. We think about what committees they're on in DC. So everybody in Washington is assigned to various committees. So we'll look at those committees and think, how do those committees correspond with the work that they do? How can we provide them with some knowledge that they can take back to their work and apply it? We also look at how they voted in the past. So are they in favor of the policies and the acts that we work with? If not, why? And that's stuff that the network can help you on. We look at what legislation they've taken a lead on in the past. So we'll Google their name and look up the legislation that they've led or supported in the past and kind of think, how does that correspond to our work? And then we also think about what relationships they have in common with our organization. So, you know, for example, I've gotten meetings with elected officials solely based on the fact that we went to the same high school, or that a board member was a good friend of theirs. So there's a lot of those relationships that you could use as leverage to get a meeting with your elected official. And we'll talk about some more of that relationship work later. We always set some priorities and goals for the visits. So what do we want to achieve? Do we want it to be an introduction to our work? Do we want to have an ask? So do we want to say that, you know, they'll commit to including an increase in RHYA appropriations as part of a letter that they send out every year? So we always try to think of what the goal is. We try to frame an ask and make sure that we know who's going to make that ask at the end of the visit. We also want to create an informative and engaging experience for them. So the work we do is really, really cool. And if you think about the experience of a legislator or a staff member, when they're in district, they're going to go to meeting after meeting after meeting after meeting. They may have a full day of meetings and be coming to you at the end of a long day. So try to think of a way that your visit is going to be different. And so the way we've done some of that is try to minimize the time that they're sitting around a table in a room. So we'll do things like get them out into our shelter. We'll get them out on the street with our outreach teams. We'll get them cooking dinner with young people. We'll have them lead or participate in a workshop with young people. When they leave the door, we always have information for them to leave with. And then we always want to know before they leave who can be our contact at the local level and in their DC office. And then follow up. So I always send a thank you letter, handwritten, and then I always make sure that they're invited to whatever event the night ministry is hosting next. A lot of times they're going to be out of the district when that event takes place, but it just shows them that, you know, there's more work that we're doing and there's more stuff that we're doing in the future. So if you want to go to the next slide. So some of the successes we've had is participating in Hill Days. So I am a firm believer that anytime you're in Washington, D.C. for work, you should be participating in some kind of a visit on the Hill. If you're at a conference that's taking place in Washington, D.C. and does not have a Capitol Hill Day, stay an extra day and make one for yourself. It can be really a great way to have some contact with the folks that are doing this work in D.C. A lot of times the staff who works in D.C. don't get to come to Chicago, so I can bring some of what we're seeing in Chicago to them in D.C. And the National Network for Youth has helped support this for us in the past. So if I'm there for a conference that isn't hosting a Hill Day, I'll just call up the network and say, hey, I'd love to do some visits. Do you guys want to come along? And that's a great thing to do. November is National Runaway Prevention Month, so utilize that as an opportunity. The National Runaway Safe Line has a bunch of different opportunities for folks to get involved in and ideas of ways that you can involve your community and your elected officials in the activities throughout that month to educate them more about the needs of youth and young adults who are experiencing homelessness. So there's things like Wear Green Day, which allows you to get a lot of social media advocacy going. You can ask your local elected officials to pass a proclamation declaring November National Runaway Prevention Month. You can invite your elected officials for site visits. Now is the time to plan those, and the National Runaway Safe Line has lots of information for you on their website. Think about who your partners are in this work. Who are your volunteers? A lot of times I feel stuck in the rut of meeting with the same 4 or 5 elected officials over and over and over again. So what we did was we looked at other elected officials outside of our normal service area that we wanted to build relationships with. And then we looked at our volunteers as a source of relationship to make those visits happen. So for example, we may not be working in legislator, Joe Blow's district, but one of the congregations that comes and volunteers with us regularly is based in that legislator's district. So we can set up a meeting through that relationship. So this helps you expand what you thought was a limited sphere of influence. And remember, we're talking a lot about Congress and advocacy with folks who work in Washington, D.C., but advocacy is very local. So you have state elected officials, you have county elected officials, you have city elected officials. One area that I really want to prioritize in our work moving forward is judges and law enforcement, because they often have to apply the policies that are made by folks in Washington, D.C., in the city of Chicago, in Cook County, and I think they're really ready for some advocacy here. So if you want to go to the next slide. So I've got some photos of advocacy that the Knight Ministry has done in district. So this first photo is Congressman Danny Davis. He's a Democrat from Chicago. He's a longtime legislator, and we have had a long relationship with him. We provide services for both youth and adults in his district. When we were moving into the West Side for the first time and opening up a program for high school students experiencing homelessness in his district, we invited him to visit the program, had a discussion about the program with him, and as a relationship building tool, he called a meeting with our state senator, with our city alderman, and our Cook County commissioner. So they all came together, and we were able to introduce the Knight Ministry to them and our work and what we wanted to do in the area. So that was really great. And another wonderful thing about Congressman Davis is that he, every year he sponsors a member letter requesting robust appropriations for runaway and homeless youth programming. And so having him as a supporter is wonderful. Building a relationship with his office has been really great for us too. So recently his DC staff contacted me because Congressman Davis, who's a Democrat on the Ways and Means Committee, was inviting his Republican counterpart on that committee, Representative Jackie Walorski from South Bend, Indiana, to Chicago to kind of see some of the work that was going on in his district. And together, the two representatives were working on some legislation around foster care. And so my relationship with the office was able to be leveraged to make that a really interesting visit, and also include the link between foster care and youth homelessness in that visit. If you want to go to the next photo. So this is Congressman Mike Quigley. Congressman Quigley represents an area in Chicago that includes 2 of our RHYA-funded programs and our main offices, our administrative offices. So this is an example where we used our relationship with the congressman around youth issues to introduce him to some of our work with adults on the street and some of our healthcare work. So we took the congressman out on the street with our street medicine program, and we kind of framed this around the work that we are doing with harm reduction and folks who are using opioids on the street. And so we introduced that topic to him, and he thought it would be an interesting visit. So instead of sitting around a table, we spent the day out on the street, riding around in a van, and he got to see some of the work that we were doing in person, but also got to see some of the issues he's talking about in DC in person. And the great thing about, or the valuable thing about Congressman Quigley is that he sits on the Appropriations Committee that determines funding for HUD. And so if you're in a COC and get funding from your COC, Congressman Quigley is one of the folks that helps determine what that funding level is. Next photo. So here is Congresswoman Jan Schakowsky. This is an example where we do not provide youth services in Congresswoman Schakowsky's ward. However, one of our congregational volunteer groups that provides meals at our youth outreach team does live in her ward or her district. So they invited the congresswoman to join them as a volunteer one of the times that they served a meal, and she accepted and came. So that was an example where she may not have accepted an invitation from us because it was happening outside of her district, but because a group inside of her district was doing work with us, she joined them and participated and was able to serve a meal and see our youth outreach team and programming. So the next slide. So all the way at the right in this is Robin Kelly, Congresswoman Robin Kelly. She's from the south side of Chicago and the south suburbs of Chicago. Congresswoman Kelly, again, we don't have any youth services in her district. However, we were able to arrange this through a partnership with Pride Action Tank. Pride Action Tank had a contest several years ago to design a tiny home that would be used by runaway and homeless youth as a housing program. Tiny homes are not legal in Chicago due to our zoning laws, and so Pride Action Tank was doing some advocacy around changing that and trying to get a pilot program of tiny homes started. We wanted to build a relationship with Congresswoman Kelly, so together the Night Ministry and Pride Action Tank invited her to tour a model of the winning tiny home, and we had some young people there to meet with her, and she was able to discuss the housing needs of young people through that visit. One of the valuable things about Congresswoman Kelly is she's an active member of the Congressional Black Caucus, and she's the leader of the Health Trust of the Congressional Black Caucus. And so when we're talking about the link between housing and healthcare, she's a valuable person to have a relationship with. Next slide. And so this is just an example of a Hill Day that we participated in. So this is great because on Hill Days, if you're at a conference with other folks from your state, you could all get together and collaborate on a Hill visit, and it can be really great because the legislator gets to learn how different organizations approach the work differently, how different organizations are seeing different things in different parts of your state, and how young people view the services that they're receiving. So in this visit, we had 2 organizations from Chicago, the Night Ministry and Ignite, which is formerly Teen Living Programs. The Night Ministry works on the north side of Chicago mainly, and a little bit on the west side, and the Night Ministry and Ignite focuses on the south side of Chicago. And then we were joined by Project Oz, which is in central Illinois, which is a more rural part of the state. And then we had Sharda, who you'll be hearing from in a couple minutes, join us as well. So that wraps up my presentation. Thanks so much.
Hello?
Thank you so much,
Hello?
Ted. Hi, Sharda. Can you hear us?
Okay, yes.
Great. Just again, thanks so much to Ted for sharing about the incredible work that you're leading there through the night ministry, both in Chicago and during your visits here to Washington, D.C. We'll go ahead and turn it over now to Sharda on how young leaders can authentically share about their experiences.
Hello, everyone. I just want to thank you for taking time out your day to listen to how important advocacy is to me. I'm Sharda Hamilton from Chicago, Illinois. I serve on the National Network for Youth Council, and I work for the night ministry as a peer outreach professional. This means so much to me because I was homeless and a single mom, and I overcame my homelessness and wanted to help and be a voice for the unheard. Today, I'm going to be speaking on the importance of advocacy, how to be an effective advocate, and connecting personal stories and lived experience to inform policy. Some of you might want to know, what do advocate mean to me? Well, it means a lot to me because I never had an advocate for myself. So being an advocate means I'm able to be a voice, I'm able to help and provide resources. But being an advocate is not very easy. You have to have certain qualities, like being able to speak up and stand up for what you believe in. Also, you have to have lived experience. How can you really put your all in something if you've never been through it? This is why having lived experience is important. When we go on Hill Day and talk to certain people, we are the youth who have experienced homeless. You might wonder, why do I feel so comfortable sharing my story? The reason is because I was once that little girl who used to be afraid to ask for help. And when you don't ask for help, you don't receive it. But being afraid or depressed is not a joke. So if I can be a voice, why not? So I feel like every organization should find that youth whose voice want to be heard and make that youth an advocate. And let's work together to become a team and fight. Thank you. Oh yeah, that's me. On Hill Day, we went to Tammy Duckworth, um, and I was able to share my story and let her know about the homeless. Well, let her know about my homeless experience and um ask her to sign the bill.
Great. Thank you so much, Sharda, for sharing about your story, your journey, and how that has continued to inform the leadership that you bring each and every time that you're on Capitol Hill and advocating on behalf of youth and young adults in your community. We'll go ahead and transition now to questions and answers for our audience. Again, if any folks have any questions, any thoughts that they wanted to share, please go ahead and use your question box in the screen. And while we're waiting for questions, we can go ahead and do some follow up. Just took some notes on both of your incredible pieces, both Sharda and Ted. Sharda, I just wanted to ask you as a follow up question, when you discussed what some of those incredible qualities of an advocate, how can local organizations ensure that the young leaders that they work with are able to bring their full selves and share those qualities when they're advocating?
The night ministry, when I was a part of the night ministry, we started a peer group, where it's different youth from different programs that came together, and that's how we was able to find different qualities and stuff to become an advocate. It was able to coach us and show us and tell us what to do.
That's awesome. And can you describe what coaching felt like? Like, what did they help with talking points? Did they help with presentations? What did that look like?
Yeah, they help with talking points, how to like talk to different people of higher power, like different legislators and things. They even had trips to Springfield to lobby days so you can get experience on it. They had people come in and sit down with us. We had trainings and things.
That's great. Thank you so much for sharing that. Sounds that it's very helpful whenever young leaders are not only able to inform the advocacy work of local organizations, but also how local organizations can continue to support and mentor young leaders as well.
Yes.
And as we're waiting for some folks to share some questions in the chat box, the next question I wanted to ask you, Ted, is you discussed how to share some of the linkages between, like, let's say, housing and healthcare. Would you have any tips and advice for other local organizations that want to be able to discuss more of those crossover areas between different issues when speaking with their legislators?
Yeah, so at the Night Ministry, we really rely on data and reports that we're producing internally. So we have a data mission fulfillment team that collects data and can share that with me. But we also rely on reports and data from our partner organizations like the National Network for Youth. So so you guys have been invaluable in our work to kind of identify what the issues look like, and then help us kind of translate those into local talking points.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that. And as again, we're waiting for folks. If anyone has any questions for either of our expert panelists and presenters, please feel free to use the chat box or question box there on your screen. A question for either of you, Sharda or Ted. So when you are discussing, how to share about solutions or even an ask when meeting with either members of Congress or even their district staffers, when's a good time to make those asks? Do you do it in an email? Do you do it at a meeting? Do you do it subsequent to a meeting?
You said when is a good time that we make them what?
The ask, like when you're asking the office to take some action.
Oh well, we used to do it like after, like especially if I'm there or another youth there. After we had told our stories and let them know what are we here fighting for. Then after that.
That's great. And there have been times that I've participated in Hill meetings when, the favorite part of the meeting for staffers is when they actually hear from young leaders themselves, because it gives them that first hand account, right, of what is taking place locally in the community. I also wanted to ask you, Sharda, given your experiences, when you are either making those asks or you're sharing stories or data, what are some of the typical questions that staffers might ask you?
The only really difficult question is just it be related to my past. They ask me something about like how did I end up in that situation or something like that. But it don't be nothing that too deep,
Right. They're just trying to get that further understanding.
Yeah.
Great. And then the next question for Ted. You mentioned earlier in the presentation about how important it is to make that personal connection, and when inviting either members of Congress or their staff to, a meeting or to a program site visit, what are some of the ways that local organizations can ensure that their content is getting read by staffers and that they're actually taking those invitations seriously?
So one of the things that we do is you have to really find the balance of what you're providing, right? So you don't want to overload them with information to take with them, but we usually limit it to like a one pager about the program that they visited, and then maybe like a summary of what we're asking for, like a fact sheet of what we're asking for. But if you give them a folder that's loaded with information, they're going to get kind of confused about what you wanted them to see. So I kind of try to craft that take-home material to make sure that it's going to be something that they pay attention to. And then when you follow up, I refer back to it. So I would say, like, as you noticed in the talking points or in the fact sheet, runaway and homeless youth reauthorization is something we really need for the following reasons. I hope that you can support this. And having that contact back in the office is really important, because you may not be able to speak to that congressman in person again for a while, but you can always reach out to the staffer, right? And the staffer's job is to get back to you. So that's kind of how I make sure that they're paying attention to it.
Thank you both, Ted, Sharda, for sharing, again, your expertise in this area and really showing everyone, the value of advocacy and finding that balance between making and finding those personal connections, to sharing anecdotal stories, to uplifting the data and programs that we know are working, and the solutions in our ask of, for example, reauthorization of the Runaway and Homeless Youth Act. I haven't seen any questions. If folks do have any questions or thoughts that they wanted to share subsequent to our webinar, we will be providing information in the following screens. But first, I did want to share that the National Network for Youth is going to be sharing more information on National Youth Advisory Key Findings that will be led by our Director of Youth Partnerships, Yori Berry, and the wonderful Sharda Hamilton next week on September 24th. If you have received some of our newsletters in the past where you heard about this webinar, then you'll likely see that being pushed out through our communication channels as well. If you are not a part of the newsletter, please feel free to reach out to me. My email address is at the very bottom towards the middle of the screen. That's joanne.paano@nnforyouth.org. If you have any questions about any of the material that was shared today, including the Advocacy Toolkit that we will be sharing shortly, please feel free to send me an email. And on that note, I wanted to thank everyone for participating in our webinar today. Sharda, Ted, thank you both so much for lending your time, energy, expertise, and for helping us understand and navigate the world of advocacy. We really appreciate your leadership and your time in joining us today.